Evil Dead Burn is a 2026 supernatural horror film directed by Sebastian Vanacek, is a part of the Evil Dead franchise. It's the most recent film to come out, and is the subject of today's episode of Neon Crew Reviews. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle, and welcome to the first installment of this new thing. So if you found this episode on the feed, or maybe it just randomly popped up, but more than likely you're familiar with the other thing that we do, you're probably asking yourself, is this a new episode of the Neon Crew, or is this a different thing? And the answer to that is yes to both. So I want to take the time to kind of explain my thought process in making this, and then we will get right into the film discussion, kind of going into more or less what the show is going to be and what you can expect in the future. So basically, I've been mulling over this idea to do this for quite some time, and I was thinking about how Mac and I get together, my co-host Mac from the Neon Crew podcast, and we discuss at least 2, sometimes 3 movies per episode about every 2 weeks. And this will include new releases, but it'll also include recommendations that we give each other. Sometimes new episodes are mostly comprised of older movies or movies that fit into a mold of discussion. And I was thinking about how 2 weeks is a pretty big gulf in between episodes to come out, especially for a podcast. And a big reason for that is we're both fairly busy men, but Mac is a lot more busy than I am. He's got children, he's got responsibilities, he's got a full-time job. I mean, I also have a full-time job, but he's also a coach, and he's pretty filled to the brim with stuff that keeps him occupied. Whereas I have a little bit more space and time and room to move when it comes to making stuff like this. You know, if the same amount of time was afforded to Mac, we would probably get together every week and do it. But nonetheless, we still have fun. We still have a good time. And some people still stick around and listen. But I had the thought of possibly doing a solo show and putting it just on the same feed that people get the Neon Crew podcast, because, you know, double up on our content. It would give people a more consistent output to enjoy and listen to, and it would allow us, or more specifically me, to cover movies that have come out that maybe we just either, you know, miss the mark, fly under the radar, or we don't have time to cover. You know, we talk about in one of our previous episodes discussing, I think it was the Minions and Monsters Playtime episode, where we talked about Supergirl being an option and how we didn't really get to cover the James Gunn Superman movie that came out last year, and how that one would have been a decent time discussing on the show, but we just, for some reason, with the timing and everything, we just didn't get around to it. So part of my goal for making this show was to hopefully be able to cover the movies that the Neon Crew podcast doesn't have the chance or the time to cover. And this is going to be a solo endeavor. Mac is not going to be a part of this show. You're just going to be stuck with me. So apologies to those who probably hate the sound of my voice and who I am as a person, which is more than likely all of you. But nevertheless, this will be something that I'm hoping to be consistent with. But this is going to act as kind of a first installment launch of this type of thing. So hopefully you guys enjoy or find this useful or productive in some way. Let me know if you do. Let me know if I'm just completely wasting my time. So today we're discussing Evil Dead Burn. Evil Dead Burn, the latest movie in the Evil Dead franchise. Now, I have seen at this point the original Sam Raimi trilogy. It took a bit to get from Evil Dead 2 to Army of Darkness. We watched both films, I think in the same day or back to back, one day after another. So in pretty quick succession, we went from Evil Dead 1 to Evil Dead 2. And then a few months passed. With this new movie coming out, I was hoping to, at this point, catch all of them, but only really had time to catch Army of Darkness, which I loved, was a lot of fun. Can easily say is my currently number one film in the Evil Dead franchise. I know that might be a little controversial. People obviously cite Evil Dead 2 as maybe their top one. I personally really like Army of Darkness. I think the camp drives that movie into the finish line of just absolute victory. But as a franchise, I think this is pretty consistent. Now, I have yet to check out the 2013 kind of remake that they released that was directed by Fede Alvarez, or the film Evil Dead Rise, directed by Lee Cronin. If you guys didn't know Lee Cronin directed that movie, you guys might not know because his name's not in the front of the title. Now, of course, we all know that he directed Lee Cronin's The Mummy because his name is there. That makes it very clear to us, and I thank the studios for allowing that to pass for us as an audience to understand. Now, I wish they gave the same grace to Evil Dead Rise. Really would have liked to know who directed that, but you know, you got to dig for that valuable information. But despite not catching those last two entries, I went and saw Evil Dead Burn in the theater with my friend Drew. Shout out to Drew. And I'm here to talk about it. So obviously this goes without saying, spoiler alert for this specific movie and maybe a little bit for Evil Dead Rise, a film that I have not seen, but you know, we can talk about it when the time comes. So, what did I think of this movie? So, I was pretty intrigued by the trailer. It reminded me a lot of a video game that I have not personally played, but that I have watched a playthrough of, Resident Evil 7. More or less just kind of the general vibe of the setting, with the characters all being a part of this family. That alone is a premise, with each of the members of the family one by one becoming Deadites and turning on each other, was enough of an interesting concept to hook me into seeing this. And just like the absolute general grimy, dirty, kind of nasty vibe that this movie has. This movie, going into it, you would have thought that this was maybe a war crime of a film, because the way people talked about this was like they had witnessed real life snuff films or something. Like, I was reading comments on Reddit and YouTube talking about how this is like one of the most violent films that they've ever seen, that this was making them feel sick to their stomach. There was stuff in this movie that was happening that they just could barely handle. And I feel like this movie, while it was pretty violent, while it had a decent amount of blood and gore and, you know, kind of that horror viscera that Evil Dead has come to embrace over the years, I feel like this is on par for a movie like this, a horror movie that nevertheless is embracing the nastiness while still maintaining a level of accessibility. You know, if you want to talk violence in movies, you know, you can always look to something like, you know, S. Craig Zahler movie or one of the Terrifier films. The violence, especially in the Terrifier franchise, is going to make something like Evil Dead Burn look kind of like a playground. And I'm not saying that to prove how edgy I am. I'm just stating a matter of fact. If you are someone who finds that sort of stuff hard to swallow, Evil Dead Burn, you'll have a bit more fun with than something like Terrifier, which is in many instances just actual torture porn. But regardless, we're not here to talk about Terrifier. We're here to talk about Evil Dead Burn. So I was pretty more or less satisfied with the kind of grossness, the aesthetic, the kind of energy that this movie was bringing. I feel like the trailer promised a sort of madness that would befall the family that you would get to experience and see unfold. And more or less you kind of do. And it's pretty consistent in that regard. I would say that as a strength for the movie, that is the film's biggest. The just constant barrage of things happening, different horror set pieces, the makeup, the blood, the viscera, the kind of energy that's carried throughout it is, for the most part, pretty consistent. You know, there's weak points that we can talk about. There's, I think, faulty parts of this movie that don't always work, but I think if you're looking for a Evil Dead film to kind of satiate that hunger of madness, you'll more or less find it here. One thing that I do find intriguing, especially when it comes to comparing it to Sam Raimi's original trilogy, is some fans find the lack of humor and how seriously this film takes itself to be quite off-putting. And I don't necessarily, I mean, obviously I can't disagree with a subjective opinion. That's people's own viewpoints, but I don't find that to be completely unforgivable. I feel like a movie, especially different movies in a franchise where different voices are kind of controlling the creative decisions behind it, I feel like they're allowed to kind of have the room and the berth to sort of do what they want and to differentiate themselves within a similar franchise. Mission Impossible as a franchise operated like that for a long time. You had your Brian De Palma, you had your John Woo, you had your J.J. Abrams, obviously Brad Bird. Like, that's a franchise that, even though it's pretty consistent in terms of it being an action spy thriller franchise, has had many different voices behind it to kind of separate each entry and make it feel unique in its own right. And I feel like Evil Dead as a franchise is, at this point, allowed to have something like that. Now, where the problem comes in that I can recognize and agree with a lot of fans in this sort of category is the way in which this movie feels a little too straightforward. That's kind of what I meant by this film being accessible in a way that, was a little bit opposite of how people were describing the grossness of this thing. There's a bit of a genericness to this movie that I don't think does it any favors. This is a film that I appreciated at the time. I enjoyed the energy. I liked what it was going for, and more or less the performances were pretty good to decent. I feel like I am not going to remember too much about this movie in maybe less than a month. And, it's kind of evident that, I saw this film about a week and a half ago, and I'm just now recording this episode on it because I decided, hey, I'm just going to try this thing out. And I'm failing to recall some of the specifics of this film and what it was going for in terms of the themes and the character dynamics. Obviously, this is a film about the idea of a family who has a lot of issues. The dynamics between them range from, lightly problematic to just straight up abusive, and that's a big theme of this movie, is abuse and how the victims are treated within the family versus protecting the abuser. And I thought that it was an interesting angle to kind of portray it as. Going hand in hand with what I was saying about the genericness of this movie, it doesn't really touch on it in a way that feels nuanced or fresh. It feels quite familiar in that it's nothing that's really going to stand out to you. The theming of this is not what you're watching this movie for. If anything, you're watching it for kind of the typical Evil Dead schlockiness of, I'm here to see deadites, I'm here to see violence, I'm here to see wacky possessions. And you are going to get that, but the major themes of abuse and family trauma and like generational trauma perhaps are things that are a little less touched on, and I don't think it's for the sake of subtlety. This movie is very unsubtle in the way it handles a lot of its characters and themes. I think it's just more so to do with prioritization of what audiences are interested in. People want, they have an expectation for a movie like this. They have an idea of what it is before they go into it, and they want to see it unfold. And people don't really want a super in-depth look at the sort of family trauma that this movie is touching on. It's doing a similar horror thing to something like Smile 2 or, horror movies of that ilk, where we are touching on a theme. We're touching on either trauma or abuse or something that has like a greater implication to the things going on, but it almost feels like an obligation. It almost feels like it's not acting as like the entire framework of the movie or what's happening, unlike a movie like Hereditary. It more or less just feels like wacky shit's happening, and this is a good explanation as to why these people are so susceptible to it. I'm not entirely familiar with the whole lore of the Evil Dead franchise or why the Deadites possess certain people. Maybe I would have to watch the other two newer movies to find out, but I would be willing to bet that the focus on the kind of family trauma and abuse that takes place in this movie is more or less used as an excuse to just see us watch terrible people get possessed and thrown around, and characters make obviously flawed decisions in this, and I do enjoy seeing flawed characters and how that dynamic plays out. It does at this point, in a world where we have movies like Hereditary and Obsession, where the flaws are defining who these characters are. It almost feels like the flaws are enacting these characters to do certain things instead of like represent the greater form of themselves. Does that make sense? Like, you get a character from Obsession who is more or less representing this idea of like male loneliness and how that manifests itself in the supernatural situation, and how that goes hand in hand with the situation that takes place in that movie. Whereas this, it's like, yeah, we got possessions, we got deadites, but we also got family trauma. And they're kind of just like banging against each other until something explodes. And you like the explosion, you like what you get, but you don't really think too much about it after the fact. I think it speaks volumes to me that Obsession has this wide spanning array of different discussion points, talking about the themes and the characters and how it relates to the supernatural thing going on. And this movie, there's like a very surface level version of that, but for the most part, people are talking about the kills. People are talking about the effects, the energy, the setting, and just like the overall kind of simplistic picture of the movie itself. So that's more or less, I think, my feelings on the themes and what the movie's going for versus what the movie actually turned out to be. And what it turned out to be, in my opinion, was a fun time that really doesn't have much going past it besides, like I said before, cool energy, cool vibes, decent performances. So we can talk about some of the performances. I really don't think there was a weak one in particular. I thought that everybody kind of was playing on a pretty even field. I especially liked, I think her name is Maud Davey, who was the grandma in the movie. I thought she did a lovely job of portraying someone with dementia who is going through, obviously the horrificness of that situation, but then switches to complete deadite mode and is going haywire. So I think it might be fun to go through the plot just to see if anything else pops up during this discussion. So obviously I said earlier, spoilers. So, if you want to check this movie out before you listen to this episode, be sure to do that before you continue on. Kind of like a caution similar to the Necronomicon. When you go and read it, just be sure you do some things before you approach that. Now, this movie opens up in a very kind of interesting way where it's two guys on a boat fishing, and they're just kind of shooting the shit. One of the guys is giving the other one a hard time about his girlfriend, who's like constantly calling him. Fun little kind of rough and tumble dynamic there. We don't really get to learn these characters' names, and if we do, they're just kind of throwaway anyway for what's about to happen, which is a deadite starts to fuck with them pretty bad. And I had this thought exercise of which one would be worse to go through. A bunch of fish hooks, like, latching onto your face, luring you into the water as you're screaming in agony, or if you're already in the water without the fish hooks, but then it starts boiling you alive. I feel like the boiling would be possibly the worst, because you're both drowning and you're feeling like you're on fire. Whereas the other one, yeah, you're getting stabbed and you're drowning, which is bad, but at least you're not on fire. Anyway, very intriguing opening. It works to kind of hook you into the movie, quite literally hook you into the movie, if you're going by the fish hooks in the scene. And then the deadite kind of just comes out of the water, walks onto the rainy highway, and this transition happens that is maybe one of the craziest transitions I've ever seen in a horror movie, where deadite gets hit by a car, which obviously is foreshadowing what happens to one of the characters later in the film. And then it just immediately cuts to woman shaking her ass in this kind of bar club sort of joint. And it was got quite the giggle from me and my buddy Drew. That was a good old hearty time. Really the only moment of kind of real humor this movie has is that that edit and that transition there is just very purposefully just a comedic beat, which I thought was, it had a good amount of fun to it. Very, very few and far between moments like that in this movie. But then obviously we're introduced to a lot of our main players. We're introduced to this family, the Prices. You've got Suhelia Yakub as Alice Price, who kind of figure out for more or less of the movie is our main character. She's kind of the one that we're following. She married into this family. She is French, and she is married to not Joseph. Joseph's the brother. William, I believe, is the character's name. She's married to William. William is brother of Joseph. Joseph is with, I believe her name is Thea. And their mom is Susan, and their dad is Edgar. And they also have a dog and a grandma. And I believe the grandma's name is Polly. But regardless, you get to learn about this family, kind of who they are in this club scene. The guy that Alice is married to is the owner of the club, but he's also kind of an asshole. He's a little condescending to his brother when he gives him the gift of this pen, where he's like, hey, you can finally finish your book or whatever the fuck you're working on, you little liberal prick. Obviously, he's not that brazen, but that's kind of what I just got from the general vibe of it. And then she and him get into an argument. He's drunk as shit. He gets in his car. And then we just kind of see the scene continue from the intro, just fully play out, where the Deadite gets hit by the car, and then he flips over, catches on fire. The severed head of the Deadite is just laughing at him. And from there on, the series of possessions starts. And the main kind of narrative hook of this movie really begins with the funeral scene. Maybe the world's most cursed funeral outside of Hereditary. With this family showing up, this very kind of bare bones family unit. There's not much of an extended family presence at this thing. It's pretty locked tight, much like the rest of the movie itself, which I kind of appreciate. But you've got this construction going on during the service. Like, everything just kind of feels wrong. The family dynamics and the relationships are just like, they range from being slightly off to like, okay, there's clearly some like not so well hidden malice here from some of the family members towards Alice, especially since she married into the family and now her husband's dead. But then you see Edgar, he's broken up. He goes over to the casket and he starts hearing his son like begging from the coffin, like, Dad, let me out, let me out. Obviously setting up something spooky to happen. And I gotta point out the cremation worker who is just listening to music, just bopping along, feels very much in line with something like a Final Destination clip, where this guy has just little to no care in the world about the morbid thing that he's partaking in, and then, as it so happens, fate finds him and he becomes a victim of the Deadite, but not before gracing the father's touch and sort of starting the building blocks of possessing him as well. And then from there, the families drive back to the house that is owned by Joseph, this family house that he's inherited, that his grandfather had been doing research out of on the occult, different things of spooky natures, including the Necronomicon, the fabled kind of MacGuffin throughout the majority of this franchise. And so you find out that his grandpa is the one who I believe was originally the guy doing the excavations and like the research in the original Evil Dead movies. So I think that was kind of cool to kind of like tie it back in there. And then from there, you get a sense of the greater dynamics of the family, which is something that I appreciate. I alluded to it earlier in mentioning how it's not the most well tied into the events that take place later, the possessions and the Deadites running amok, possessing each family member one by one. Each character has like their own kind of bit-o-trauma that I use that term to kind of describe what's going on in this movie, but I feel it's appropriate because each person having their own little thing adds enough intrigue to this movie to kind of like just get you in the door, but it's not really enough to kind of hook you in and like keep you running through the through line of what this movie's going for. So like, I won't get too much into detail, but they talk about Joseph and like his failed writing career and like how he's trying to pursue that, but then like you learn later in the movie he makes kind of a cowardly decision, and that sort of more or less just defines him. And you get a similar thing with the other characters, like the mom character, for example. Obviously, like, she comes across as like kind of prim and proper and like very controlling, but you know, there's like a rage to her. And then obviously like the father has his own issues that he's dealing with. Is like, even before kind of like the possession takes place, you see like this quiet rage inside of him that's just like waiting to burst out. And then, that's pretty much just the building blocks of an excuse that you need to kind of make this like, oh, it's a wacky family out in the middle of nowhere in this dilapidated mansion house. And like I mentioned before, very kind of like Resident Evil 7 vibes, very fucked up family in this grimy location. But what I appreciate about the setting and the way that things start to kick off, you know, you get this dinner scene with all of them together and everybody's kind of just on edge. And it's a scene that I appreciate, I think, more for what it represents than its general effectiveness, which is everybody's getting a jab at somebody. And like, it doesn't feel like anybody is specifically the target. I mean, Alice herself is, I think, the biggest victim in all of this, being, as you come to find out, a victim of abuse from her husband who is deceased, and the family just kind of reckoning with the idea that their son might be a piece of shit. So you get everybody around the table just like constantly like giving little jabs at each other, and it makes for a very dynamic scene that ends with the dad, who's like kind of half possessed at this point, just like stabbing the shit out of the dog, which is upsetting. It's an upsetting scene. I can't say that I didn't see something like that coming. Obviously, with the trailers and everything going on, with the premise of like, yeah, you know, they're each gonna fall in their own way, you kind of had a feeling that the dog was gonna get it somehow, and it does. But I don't really think it was like that effective in hooking us in emotionally. Obviously, when a pet dies in a movie, you want it to like have an impact or mean something. You don't want it to feel like completely indiscriminate and thrown away. And it sort of feels the case with that in this movie, that the dog is just there and then it's killed and then it's possessed. So you get a dead-eyed dog, but not much really happens with the dead-eyed dog. That's kind of my other sort of gripe with this as well, is that he doesn't really get to do much. He gets possessed, he gets glowing eyes, he's kind of aura farming outside the house, but then, you know, he just gets stabbed at the end, which, yeah, I guess, cool, we get to see another dog stabbing. That's great. But after the dinner scene is when things really start to kick off. You get the father stabbing the dog. He's all fucked up. Joseph and Thea drive him to the hospital, or they try to at least, before he goes sicko mode again. And then he rams a seat head through Thea's throat, which is crazy. And it displays a scene of Joseph having him at gunpoint, but then not having the guts to shoot him. Obviously introducing this complicated thing of, he's my dad, do I shoot him? But also he's clearly like out of his mind, like, I need to save my girlfriend or fiance or whoever the character of Thea represents. Like I said before, just kind of the bare building blocks of character depth and dynamics there. But from there, the movie really kind of just goes off rip once it gets back to the house and they try to lock Edgar out, who they realize is possessed with the dog. They see that Thea comes back, she's possessed, and then from there, everything just goes fucking haywire. And that's really kind of when you start to attach yourself to Alice as the main character. Joseph is pretty prominent throughout it too. I would say is the kind of secondary lead of this movie, but more or less you're sticking with her. And the performances of them as Deadites is a lot of fun. Like, you get to see these different types of actors in these situations just kind of really play off of the mania, and that part in of itself is simple but fun. It's engaging, it's frenetic, the kills are cool, the effects are for the most part, they range from, I think, decent to pretty good. It's believable enough to kind of get you immersed in the environment. And one thing I especially love in it being set in a house like this is that it really allows for full use of setting. I am a huge fan of when movies get full use out of their environment and like take it to the absolute advantage of what the movie's going for. I like to think of a guilty pleasure movie called Nonstop, which is a Liam Neeson action movie that takes place in an airplane, where he's like a U.S. Marshal, and he's got to figure out who is sending him threatening terrorist texts. And that movie is not good. It's not even a movie that I would recommend to people that much. But one thing I love about that movie, unironically, is the way it uses the environment. That it just feels completely like lived in and fully realized. And this movie does a similar thing where you kind of start at the ground level, and then as the movie goes, Alice works her way up, and it almost feels like a kind of ascendance into hell, if that makes sense. It's a nice kind of inverse as to what we're used to seeing, whereas like, Deadites in previous films are in basements. You got characters that have to like keep going down and going lower. This is fun in that like the character keeps going up into kind of like the creepy attic space where she has to find the artifact. I mean, that's essentially what the Deadites are after, is they're after a dagger that could be used to kill them and exile them from our own mortal plane. And so she does that. She works her way up. You get a really cool scene in the bathroom that uses a lot of cool like camera tricks and editing techniques that perpetuate the energy that this movie's going for. And I think that that's just really kind of cool. Kind of sets this movie above the sort of average schlocky horror that you would come to expect. And it's stylistic enough to where it still retains a level of fun. A lot of people are kind of dogging on this movie, saying that it takes itself too seriously, and I think in some instances I might agree, but I think that there's still a level of fun with the Deadites and with the editing of this that you can just like grab onto it and say to yourself, okay, this movie is going to take care of me in at least that way. It's going to do something to carry me through to make it feel like a proper entry in the Evil Dead franchise. So she gets the dagger, starts laying haymakers on the rest of the Deadite family. At this point, she's pretty much the only one that isn't taken over or possessed by this thing. And it culminates in this confrontation that she has with the body of her ex-husband, boyfriend, whatever. I guess it is her husband, but his like charred remains that are now possessed by a Deadite, just like chasing after her. I like the idea of that a lot. I don't know if the execution of that fully worked. I think the special effects and the way that they filmed it in like this kind of shadowy, ethereal sort of way felt a little too goopy and unbelievable for me in a franchise that is exemplary for using so many different practical effects and like, special effects work and that sort of thing. You would think that they would want to retain that for the sake of making the thing just look a little bit more realistic and less like a scary CGI monster that is chasing her. So I was just a little bit let down with that. We're out of the house. We're at this like kind of like industrial facility that she's like trapped in. She's in danger of burning alive from this like tar that's building up, that she's like kind of trapped in this pit. But then she climbs out, sends him in it, and then you get like a last moment where as she's stabbing him in the head with a dagger, she like sees him as he used to be, like his human form. And it, I think, is a again, I kind of see what they're going for, reminding you that at one point these things were human and that they had like real consciousness and feeling to them. But the message of this movie being domestic violence and abuse and like kind of a family dynamic with dealing with that, it doesn't really feel like it's touching on that in any way, and more or less just showing us, yep, this used to be a person. This used to be a guy that she loved or maybe was afraid of even before he turned bad, and that's just how it is. That's just what it is. So the movie ends with that, and that's more or less the plot of the film. And I think overall, as far as the story goes, you're not going to get too much with it. The characters are fun enough, but they're pretty one note. They have like their own little thing that kind of makes them interesting from a performance standpoint, but not necessarily a character writing standpoint. But if they want to keep making movies like this, I'm not going to have too much of an issue with it. I would just hope that they would perhaps include a little bit more in the way of cohesive theming with the energy that this movie promises. So, yep, there you have it. That's more or less the story of Evil Dead Burn. We can talk about, I guess this is an interesting point, a little bit more or less the teaser that this movie ends on. The movie ends with a kind of Evil Dead Rise scene where the character of Ellie shows up as an apparition for this little girl, and there's something that takes place there. You know, my memory of it is kind of hazy, but more or less I remember the construction of the scene all the same. I thought it was an interesting choice to include that, and people have talked about her performance in Evil Dead Rise being one of the better parts of that movie, and honestly being one of the highlights of kind of this newer batch of films that we're getting. So very interested in seeing how that manifests. This movie, I think, did fairly well. I think it did well enough. $20 million budget. It's currently at $51.4 million. Obviously, that doesn't include marketing costs, but also I'm assuming we're going to see a bump of that when it comes to streaming. So we can look forward more than likely to more entries in the Evil Dead franchise. But for now, that was kind of more or less my thoughts on Evil Dead Burn. So to give this a final rating, I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10. I thought this was a fun time. I enjoyed it. I would, if I did a franchise rewatch, happily throw this one on as something to look forward to. But obviously, when it comes to a horror movie, there's things that you can do that you can get more out of the theming. I think that there's the potential for a deeper, more meaningful movie in here somewhere, but what we got was kind of surface level schlocky fun, and that's what I take away from it. That's what I'm walking away having the biggest sense of. So Evil Dead Burn, 7 out of 10. So what I watched this past week. So this is going to be a segment of the show that I include at the end that I'll kind of lightly touch on the movies that I watched, just more or less talking about films in general and getting my very basic thoughts out there. So I pulled up my Letterboxd diary, have yet to figure out what I'm going to call this segment, but, you know, we're just kind of going with the flow. This is sort of a beta test of an episode, and we're just going to figure out from there how best to approach this. But I'm going to start with the 12th. It's also the same day that I watched Evil Dead Burn. And then the movie that I watched after that was Independence Day, the very same day. And then the day after that was The Patriot. So 2 Roland Emmerich movies. We just came out with our episode on Independence Day and The Patriot. Mac and I talk about 2 Roland Emmerich films. You get our thoughts on that. It's a 2-hour, 40-minute discussion on, you know, things that I bump up against with those 2 films specifically. Roland Emmerich as a filmmaker, and then Mac talks about some of the more positive aspects of what works for a lot of people when it comes to those films. I think it's a very interesting, fascinating discussion that goes into many different places and jumps all around. So if you are interested in what we had to say about those films, definitely check that out. On the 15th, I watched Milk and Cereal. So I was talking about Obsession earlier. Curry Barker's Obsession, a movie, again, that we didn't cover on the Neon Crew podcast, that if I had started this idea sooner, I probably would have touched on this show. But I was curious to check out Curry Barker's other feature film. This is only an hour long, so it wasn't too much of a hassle to pull up. It's also free on YouTube. And it's a fun kind of found footage look at 2 guys who have a YouTube prank channel. Obviously, the way that Curry Barker's content is set up, this has a little bit more going on. I was fairly impressed with the amount of moving pieces in this and just sort of like the slightly complicated nature of the storytelling and the non-linear, different perspective way in which we see it unfold. I thought it was fairly interesting. I didn't quite find it creepy or scary. I just thought of it more as a look at how you could construct a very interesting piece of storytelling, which I think that Curry Barker manages to accomplish with this. Obviously, I think the performances range from okay to like fairly good. Curry Barker being the standout. I think he's, you know, using his very expressive face to his advantage in the performance of this. Not going to give away spoilers, but you know, there's a very clear kind of indication of where his character heads, and it's very interesting and fun. So that I gave a 7 out of 10. Also, if you want to know the ratings for the other 2 previous movies I talked about, the Roland Emmerich ones, check out the episode. Listen to the discussion. You'll find out why I gave them the rating I gave them. Next up, we have Spirited Away. Watched that movie yesterday on the 19th. I've seen that movie before. This is probably, I think, my 3rd time watching it, and it is absolutely a top Miyazaki for me. It's always hard to pick from the ones that I absolutely love from him, Boy and the Heron, Princess Mononoke, and then Spirited Away being my top 3. Obviously, this movie is a 9 out of 10. It's the first Miyazaki I watched, so obviously it has kind of a special place in my heart when it comes to that. And I think just rewatching it solidified my feelings on it even further. The animation's gorgeous. The music is touching and compelling. Just like the composition of each scene in animated form, I think is really well done. Check out Spirited Away. It's on HBO Max. What the hell are you doing if you haven't seen it before? And then finally, today, I watched The Odyssey, which I'm not going to get too much into. You're going to get my thoughts on that in the next episode of the Neon Crew podcast coming out. And that will be about less than 2 weeks away from when this episode is released. So look forward to that. Next on the docket will probably be another episode of this. I'm not sure what film I'll be talking about yet, but hopefully, if you guys are interested, you'll get to see something pop up on the feed. Hopefully this goes well enough and that I feel good enough about it to release it in some form, but I appreciate you guys listening to this episode of Neon Crew Reviews. Check out our other show. Check out the Neon Crew podcast. We've been doing it for years and could benefit from people listening and benefit from feedback, benefit from, whatever else you want to throw at my head. But until next time, my name is Kyle, and I'm signing off. Have a good one.